The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the dusty mercantile, and Julia Norton pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching as the frontier town of Steins Pass, New Mexico territory, materialized through the grit-covered glass like a mirage she both longed for and dreaded. It was September 1878, and she had traveled 3 weeks from St. Louis with nothing but 2 worn carpetbags and a pass that weighed heavier than any trunk she could have carried. The other passengers had avoided her eyes during the journey, as though they could sense the shame she carried like a brand upon her soul, though none of them knew the truth of what she fled from or why her hands trembled as she stepped down onto the wooden platform. The heat hit her immediately, a dry blanket of desert air that was nothing like the humid summers back east. Julia adjusted her simple brown traveling dress and tried to smooth the wrinkles that had settled into the fabric during the long journey. Her dark hair, once carefully styled in fashionable curls, hung in a loose bun at the nape of her neck, and she knew she must look as worn as she felt. At 22 years old, she felt ancient, as though the weight of her mistakes had added decades to her young life. "Miss Norton." A voice called from beside the mercantile, and Julia turned to see a middle-aged woman in a practical calico dress approaching with purposeful strides. "I'm Mrs. Henderson. I run the boarding house here in town. Mr. Patterson at the Territorial Employment Office wired ahead that you'd be arriving today." Julia managed a small smile, grateful that at least someone was expecting her. "Yes, madam. Thank you for meeting me, Mrs." Henderson's sharp eyes took in Julia's appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen plenty of worn-down travelers pass through this remote outpost. "You look tired, dear. Let's get you settled at the boarding house, and then we can discuss your employment situation. There are a few families in the area looking for help, and I understand you have experience with housekeeping and cooking." "Yes, madam," Julia replied, following as Mrs. Henderson led her down the dirt street. She had written careful lies in her application letter, omitting the parts of her history that would have made her unemployable. She did not mention that she had worked in a gambling hall in St. Louis for nearly 2 years, serving drinks to rough men and enduring their wandering hands while her employer looked the other way. She did not mention that she had fled when one of those men, a wealthy businessman with a wife and children, had decided he wanted more from her than just friendly conversation and had cornered her in the back room. She had fought him off, but in doing so had knocked over a lamp that set fire to the establishment. The building had burned, and though no one had died, the owner had blamed her, threatened to have her arrested, and Julia had run rather than face prison for defending herself. The guilt of it gnawed at her constantly. She had cost people their livelihoods, even if it had been an accident, even if she had been fighting for her dignity. The fire had consumed not just the building but also any chance she had of building a respectable life in St. Louis. So she had answered an advertisement for domestic workers needed in the New Mexico territory, a place so far from her mistakes that perhaps she could start fresh. The boarding house was a modest 2-story structure with whitewashed walls and a covered porch where several rocking chairs sat empty in the afternoon heat. Mrs. Henderson showed Julia to a small room on the 2nd floor, sparsely furnished but clean, with a window that looked out over the main street of Steins Pass and the dramatic mountains beyond. "Rest up this evening," Mrs. Henderson said kindly. "Tomorrow morning, I'll take you to meet some potential employers. There's the Reverend's wife who needs help with her growing family, and then there's Mr. Vincent Jameson, who has a ranch about 5 miles northeast of town. He's been looking for someone to help with his household for months now, but he's particular about who he hires." Julia nodded, already feeling the exhaustion of the journey settling into her bones. I appreciate any opportunity, madam. I'm willing to work hard. After Mrs. Henderson left, Julia sat on the edge of the narrow bed and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough over the past months. What she needed now was to prove to herself that she could build something better, that she was more than her worst moments. That night, she barely slept, her mind racing with worries about the interviews tomorrow. What if they asked too many questions about her past? What if someone from St. Louis had sent word ahead, warning people about her? The Territorial Employment Office had accepted her application based on her references from her childhood employer, an elderly woman she had helped care for before her parents died. But that felt like a lifetime ago, before poverty and desperation had forced her into less respectable work. Morning came with a brilliant sunrise that painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and pink. Julia dressed carefully in her best day dress, a modest blue cotton that she had mended multiple times but which still looked presentable. She pinned her hair into a neat style and joined Mrs. Henderson downstairs for a simple breakfast of biscuits and coffee. "The Reverend's wife is feeling poorly this morning, so we'll start with Mr. Jameson," Mrs. Henderson announced as they finished eating. "I'll drive you out in the wagon. It's a fair distance, and the walk would be too much in this heat." As they traveled northeast out of Steins Pass, Julia watched the landscape transform from the cluster of buildings that made up the town to open desert dotted with scrub brush, and the occasional cluster of trees near dry creek beds. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks jagged against the impossibly blue sky. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, and Julia felt a strange kinship with this wild land. "Mr. Jameson is a good man," Mrs. Henderson said, breaking the silence. "He came out here about 7 years ago and built his ranch from nothing. Works harder than any 3 men combined, but he's lonely out there, I think. His wife passed away 4 years back, giving birth to their first child. The baby died, too. He hasn't been quite the same since." Julia's heart clenched with sympathy. "That's terrible." "It is," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "He needs someone to help with the cooking and cleaning, and he's hoping to find someone who might stay long term. He's had a few women come and go, but none have lasted more than a few weeks. The isolation gets to them, I suppose." They crested a small rise, and Julia saw the ranch spread out below them. It was more substantial than she had expected, with a sturdy house built from adobe and wood, a large barn, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals where cattle grazed. A windmill turned slowly in the breeze, pumping water into a large trough. Everything looked well maintained and orderly, the sign of someone who took pride in their work. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, and Julia felt her breath catch slightly. Even from a distance, she could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his surroundings. He wore work clothes, dusty from labor, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face until they drew closer. Mrs. Henderson pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, and the man approached, removing his hat. Julia found herself looking into a weathered face that spoke of long hours under the sun and hard-won experience. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was something in his expression, a guardedness mixed with a deep weariness, that Julia recognized because she saw the same thing in her own mirror. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow suited the vast openness of the landscape. His eyes moved to Julia, and she saw curiosity there, tempered with caution. "This the young woman you mentioned, Vincent Jameson. This is Miss Julia Norton." Mrs. Henderson made the introductions. She arrived yesterday from St. Louis and is looking for a position. Julia climbed down from the wagon, grateful when her legs proved steady despite her nervousness. Up close, she could see the fine lines around Vincent's eyes, the way his jaw was set as though he was prepared for disappointment. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Jameson." He studied her for a long moment, and Julia forced herself not to look away, even though she felt as though those gray eyes could see straight through to all her secrets. Finally, he nodded slightly. "Come inside. We can talk about what the position would involve." The house was cool and dim after the bright sunshine, and Julia's eyes took a moment to adjust. The main room was large, with a kitchen area on one side and a sitting area with a fireplace on the other. Everything was clean but sparse, functional rather than comfortable. There were no curtains on the windows, no decorative touches, nothing that spoke of a woman's presence. It was the home of a man who had stopped caring about such niceties. "I'll wait out here, Mrs. Henderson said, settling herself on the porch. "You two talk." Vincent gestured for Julia to take a seat at the large wooden table that dominated the kitchen area. He remained standing, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "Mrs. Henderson probably told you I'm looking for help with household tasks. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, that sort of thing. I spend most of my time working the ranch, and I don't have the energy to keep up with everything else. I had a woman from town coming out 3 times a week, but she got married last month and moved to Texas with her husband." Julia nodded. "I have experience with all of those tasks, Mr. Jameson. I'm a hard worker and I learn quickly if there's anything I don't know. Where did you work before?" he asked, and Julia felt her stomach tighten. She had prepared for this question, had rehearsed her answer during the long stagecoach ride. "I worked for a family in St. Louis as a housekeeper. Before that, I helped care for an elderly woman who was a friend of my parents." Both statements were technically true, though they omitted the years in between that she was desperate to forget. Why leave St. Louis? Vincent's eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Julia met his gaze steadily, even as her heart hammered. "I needed a fresh start, Mr. Jameson. St. Louis held too many difficult memories after my parents passed away." Also true, as far as it went. He was quiet for a long moment, and Julia thought perhaps he saw through her careful half-truths. But then he nodded slowly. "I understand something about needing a fresh start. This land has a way of letting you leave the past behind if you're willing to work hard enough." Relief flooded through her, but Julia kept her expression neutral. "I'm very willing to work hard. The position would require you to be here 6 days a week," Vincent continued. "I'd need you here by 6 in the morning to prepare breakfast, and your duties would run until after supper is cleaned up, usually around 7 or 8 in the evening. Sundays you'd have free. The pay is $30 a month plus meals while you're here." Mrs. Henderson said you're staying at her boarding house. That should cover your room and board there with some left over. $30 a month was more than generous for domestic work, and Julia felt a flicker of hope. "That would be acceptable, Mr. Jameson." "There's one more thing," he said, and something in his tone made Julia tense. "I need someone reliable, Miss Norton. Someone who's going to stay, not run off after a few weeks because the isolation gets to them or they find the work too hard. I don't have the time or inclination to keep training new people. If you take this position, I need your word that you'll commit to at least 6 months." 6 months felt like an eternity and a gift all at once. 6 months to prove herself, to build a new life, to leave Julia Norton, the gambling hall girl, behind and become someone she could respect. "You have my word, Mr. Jameson." He studied her face for another long moment, then pushed off from the wall and extended his hand. "Then we have an agreement. Can you start tomorrow? Julia shook his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard physical labor, the strength in his grip. Yes, sir. Thank you for this opportunity. Something flickered in his eyes, almost like sympathy. We all deserve a chance to start over, Miss Norton. The words struck her deeply, and Julia wondered what Vincent Jameson's story was, what had put that haunted look in his eyes. But she simply nodded and followed him back outside where Mrs. Henderson waited. On the ride back to Steins Pass, Mrs. Henderson chattered happily about how well the interview had gone, but Julia was quiet, lost in thought. She had secured employment, which was a relief. But she had also made a promise, and she was determined to keep it. No more running. No more letting her past define her future. That night, Julia lay in her bed at the boarding house and thought about Vincent Jameson. There was something about him that called to her, a recognition of shared pain perhaps. He had loved and lost, carried his grief like a weight, and yet he continued building his life. Maybe she could learn something from his example. The next morning, Julia woke before dawn and dressed quickly. Mrs. Henderson had arranged for one of the town's young men to drive Julia out to the ranch each morning and pick her up each evening, for a small fee that would come out of her wages. It was worth it to not have to walk the 5 miles each way in the desert heat. The sky was just beginning to lighten when they arrived at the ranch. Julia thanked the driver and walked up to the house, her nerves fluttering. Vincent was already up. She could see lamplight glowing from the windows. She knocked softly on the door. "It's open," his voice called, and Julia stepped inside. Vincent was seated at the table, working on some kind of ledger by lamplight. He looked up as she entered, and Julia saw surprise flicker across his face, as though he had expected her not to show up. "Miss Norton, you're early. I wanted to make sure I had time to figure out where everything is before I needed to start breakfast," Julia explained. Something that might have been approval crossed his features. "There's a lamp on the counter there. Let me show you around." He led her through the house, pointing out where supplies were kept, explaining his preferences for meals, showing her the washroom and how the stove worked. Julia paid careful attention, filing away every detail. The house was larger than it had seemed yesterday, with 2 bedrooms, though Vincent mentioned he only used one. The other had been intended for the nursery, Julia realized with a pang of sadness. "I usually take breakfast around 6:30, dinner at noon when I come in from the morning work, and supper around 7, Vincent told her. "Nothing fancy, just simple food that sticks to your ribs. I'll be working around the ranch most days, but I'm never too far if you need anything. Just ring the bell outside the kitchen door." "I understand," Julia said. Vincent retrieved his hat from a peg by the door. "Then I'll leave you to it. Coffee's already brewed if you want some." After he left, Julia stood in the quiet kitchen and took a deep breath. She could do this. It was just cooking and cleaning, tasks she had done her whole life in one form or another. She poured herself a cup of the strong coffee and began exploring the pantry and root cellar, planning out the day's meals. By the time Vincent came in for breakfast, Julia had prepared eggs, bacon, biscuits, and fried potatoes. She set the plate in front of him with hands that only trembled slightly, then retreated to the sink to begin washing the cooking pans. "Miss Norton," Vincent's voice made her turn. He was looking at the food with something like wonder. "This is excellent. Best breakfast I've had in longer than I can remember." Warmth spread through Julia's chest at the simple praise. "Thank you, Mr. Jameson. I'm glad you're enjoying it." As he ate, Julia busied herself with cleaning, acutely aware of his presence. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was weighted with all the things neither of them was saying. When Vincent finished, he brought his plate to the sink, a gesture that surprised Julia. "You don't have to do that," she said quickly. "Habit," he replied. I've been cleaning up after myself for a long time." He paused, seeming to consider his next words. "I know Mrs. Henderson probably told you about my wife." Julia nodded carefully. "Yes, sir. I'm very sorry for your loss." His jaw tightened, and for a moment Julia thought he might shut down the conversation. But then he spoke again, his voice rough. "Emily was a good woman. She deserved better than to die in this harsh place, trying to give me a child." He looked out the window toward the vast expanse of his land. "Some days I wonder if I'm cursed to lose everyone I care about." The raw pain in his words cut through Julia's own defenses. "I don't believe in curses, Mr. Jameson. Sometimes terrible things happen, and we have to find a way to keep living despite them." He turned to look at her, really look at her, and Julia saw recognition in his eyes. "You speak like someone who knows something about terrible things." "I do," Julia admitted, though she didn't elaborate, "but I'm trying to move forward." "That makes two of us then," Vincent said quietly. Then he cleared his throat and headed for the door. "I'll be back at noon." The days fell into a rhythm. Julia arrived each morning before dawn and left after dark, her hands constantly busy with the work of maintaining the household. She cooked hearty meals that Vincent consumed with genuine appreciation, scrubbed floors that hadn't seen proper care in years, mended his worn work clothes, and slowly brought order and even a touch of warmth to the sparse house. Vincent was a man of few words, but Julia learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders, the way he removed his hat, the rare smiles that transformed his stern face into something almost boyish. He worked relentlessly, up before dawn and often not finishing until well after dark. Julia watched him through the kitchen window sometimes, mending the endless fences, working with the cattle, repairing equipment, always moving, as though if he stopped he might have to think about things he preferred to keep buried. She understood that impulse intimately. 2 weeks into her employment, Julia was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see Vincent riding in fast, and even from a distance, she could see something was wrong. He dismounted in a fluid motion and strode toward her, his face tight with concern. "Miss Norton, I need to ride into Steins Pass for supplies, and there's a storm coming in." He gestured toward the western sky where dark clouds were building with ominous speed. "You should come with me. I can't guarantee I'll make it back before it hits, and I don't want you stranded here alone." Julia looked at the approaching storm, then at the laundry she was hanging. "I should finish this first." "Leave it," Vincent said firmly. "These desert storms can be dangerous. Flash floods, lightning. It's not worth the risk." The urgency in his voice convinced her. Julia quickly gathered the clothes she had already hung and brought them inside, then accepted Vincent's hand to help her up onto his horse. She had ridden before, but never like this, seated in front of him on the saddle with his arms around her as he controlled the reins. She was acutely aware of his warmth against her back, the solid strength of him, the way he smelled of leather and sun-warmed skin. They made it to town just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Vincent guided the horse to the mercantile and helped Julia dismount, then led the animal around to the shelter behind the building. By the time he joined Julia inside, the storm had unleashed in earnest, rain hammering the roof with deafening force. The mercantile owner, Mr. Paulson, looked up from behind his counter. "Cutting it close there, Vincent." "Closer than I'd like," Vincent agreed. He turned to Julia, rain dripping from his hat. "This might be a while. There's a restaurant 2 doors down if you want to wait there. I'll settle up here and join you." Julia made her way through the downpour to the small restaurant, arriving soaked despite the short distance. Inside, several other townspeople had taken shelter, including Mrs. Henderson, who waved Julia over to her table. "How are you settling in at the Jameson Ranch?" Mrs. Henderson asked as Julia joined her. "Very well," Julia replied honestly. "Mr. Jameson is a fair employer." "And how is Vincent doing?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes were kind but knowing. "He's shut himself off from people for so long. It does my heart good knowing someone is out there with him, even just during the day." Before Julia could respond, a woman at the next table leaned over. She was perhaps 40, with sharp features and an expression that immediately put Julia on guard. "You're the new girl working for Vincent Jameson. You might want to be careful out there, all alone with a man." Julia felt her defenses rise. "Mr. Jameson has been nothing but proper and respectful." The woman sniffed. "I'm just saying people talk. A young, unmarried woman spending all day at an unmarried man's home, it could damage your reputation." "Mrs. Crawford, that's enough," Mrs. Henderson said sharply. "Julia is doing honest work and there's nothing improper about it." But the damage was done. Julia felt the old shame creeping back, the sense that no matter how hard she tried, people would always find something to criticize. In St. Louis, she had been shamed for the work she did in the gambling hall. Here, she was being shamed for honest domestic work. There was no winning, it seemed. Vincent arrived a few minutes later, shaking rain from his coat. His eyes found Julia immediately, and she saw him take in her stiff posture, the way Mrs. Crawford was looking at her with disapproval. His expression hardened. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, his voice cold. "I couldn't help but overhear your comments as I came in. Let me be clear. Miss Norton is an employee, nothing more. If I hear that you or anyone else in this town is spreading gossip about her or damaging her reputation, you'll answer to me. Are we understood?" Mrs. Crawford's face flushed red. "I was only concerned for the girl's welfare." "Then you can show that concern by keeping your thoughts to yourself," Vincent replied. He turned to Julia, his expression softening slightly. "The storm's not letting up. We'll have to wait it out." "Can I get you some coffee?" Julia nodded, grateful for his defense but also acutely aware that he had just made them the center of attention in the small restaurant. As Vincent ordered coffee for them both, she caught the curious looks from other patrons, the whispered conversations behind hands. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid, drawing attention to herself, giving people reason to look too closely at her past. They sat at a corner table, and for a while neither of them spoke. Finally, Vincent leaned forward, his voice low enough that only Julia could hear. "Don't let people like Mrs. Crawford get to you. She's got nothing better to do than mind other people's business." "It's not just her," Julia said quietly. "People always find something to judge. Back in St. Louis." She stopped, realizing she was about to reveal more than she intended. "What happened in St. Louis?" Vincent asked gently. Julia looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw genuine concern there, not judgment. Something in her wanted to tell him everything, to unburden herself of the secrets that weighed so heavily. But fear held her back. If he knew the truth, would he still defend her? Or would he send her away like everyone else? "I made mistakes," she said finally. "I worked in places I shouldn't have because I needed money. I'm not proud of it, but I didn't have many choices after my parents died and left me with nothing." Vincent was quiet for a moment, and Julia braced herself for the disgust, the disappointment. But when he spoke, his voice was matter of fact. "Survival makes us do things we never imagined we'd do. I don't judge you for that, Miss Norton." The relief was so intense that Julia felt tears prick at her eyes. Most people would. "Then most people haven't lived hard enough to understand," Vincent said. He reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, briefly touched her hand. The gesture was over almost before it began, but Julia felt the warmth of it long after. "The only thing that matters is our future, not the past we're trying to leave behind. You're doing good work at the ranch, honest work. That's all that matters to me." Julia felt something crack open in her chest, a wall she had built around her heart beginning to crumble. "Thank you, Mr. Jameson. That means more than you know." They sat together in the restaurant until the storm passed, talking more freely than they ever had before. Vincent told her about building the ranch, about the challenges of making a living from the harsh land, about his dreams for expanding his herd. Julia shared carefully edited stories from her childhood, the good memories from before everything fell apart. And slowly, hesitantly, they began to build something that felt almost like friendship. When they finally made it back to the ranch, the desert was washed clean and the air smelled of rain and sage. Vincent insisted on checking that the house was secure before Julia's ride back to town arrived. As they walked through the rooms together, Julia was acutely aware of the shift between them, the way the walls they had both kept up were beginning to lower. "Miss Norton," Vincent said as they stood in the main room. "Julia, if I may, I want you to know that what I said in town, I meant it. Your past doesn't define you, not to me." Julia looked up at him, this lonely rancher who had his own share of grief and pain, and felt her heart skip. "Then please call me Julia." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. "Only if you call me Vincent." From that day forward, something changed between them. The formality gave way to an easy companionship that surprised them both. Vincent began staying in the kitchen while Julia cooked, ostensibly to keep up with paperwork at the table, but really, Julia suspected, for the company. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing thoughts and stories that they had kept locked away from the rest of the world. Julia found herself looking forward to each day at the ranch with an eagerness that had nothing to do with the work and everything to do with the man who employed her. She noticed small things about Vincent, the way he was always gentle with the animals, how he tipped his hat to her each morning when she arrived, the rare laugh that rumbled from his chest when something genuinely amused him. She saw the loneliness that haunted him, the way he sometimes stared at the empty bedroom that should have been a nursery, the careful distance he kept from the townspeople. And Vincent, though he fought against it at first, found himself drawn to Julia in ways that terrified him. He had promised himself after Emily died that he would never care that deeply again, would never risk that kind of devastating loss. But Julia slipped past his defenses without even trying. He found excuses to come back to the house during the day, to check on things that didn't need checking. He stayed longer at meals, asking her opinion on ranch matters that he had always decided alone. And at night, in the silence of his empty house, he found himself thinking about her smile, her kindness, the strength he saw in her eyes that spoke of someone who had survived things that should have broken her. October arrived with cooler temperatures and brilliant blue skies. One Saturday afternoon, Vincent appeared at the kitchen door with a proposition. "Julia, I need to ride out to check on the cattle in the north pasture. It's beautiful country up there. Would you like to come along? You've been working hard for weeks without a break." Julia hesitated. Going on what amounted to a recreational ride with Vincent felt like crossing a line from employer and employee into something else entirely. But the hopeful look in his eyes decided her. "I'd like that." He saddled a gentle mare for her, and they rode out together across the desert landscape. Vincent led them along a path that wound through stands of juniper and pinon pine, climbing gradually toward higher elevations. He pointed out landmarks, told her the names of plants and animals, shared the history of the land with an obvious love for it. They reached the north pasture in early afternoon. The cattle were grazing peacefully, and beyond them, the view stretched for miles, mountains and valleys painted in shades of gold and rust under the autumn sun. Vincent dismounted and helped Julia down, and they stood side by side looking at the vista. It's beautiful, Julia breathed. It is, Vincent agreed. When I first came here and saw this land, I knew I had to make it mine. Even with all the hardship, all the loss, I've never regretted that choice. This place saved me in a lot of ways. Julia understood what he meant. The ranch, the endless work, it had given him a purpose when grief might have destroyed him. What was she like? She asked softly. Emily. Vincent was quiet for so long that Julia thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice distant with memory. She was kind, patient. She loved this land almost as much as I did. We met in Denver when I was buying supplies for the ranch. She was a school teacher, proper and educated, way too good for a rough rancher like me. But somehow I convinced her to take a chance on me. He paused, pain flickering across his face. She was so excited when she found out she was going to have a baby. She had so many plans, so many dreams, and then everything went wrong. The labor went on too long and there was no doctor close enough to help. I watched her slip away and there was nothing I could do. Julia's heart ached for him. I'm so sorry, Vincent. For a long time I blamed myself, he continued. Blamed this place, blamed God. I thought about selling the ranch, leaving, going somewhere where everything didn't remind me of what I'd lost. But I couldn't. Emily is buried here. My son is buried beside her on that hill behind the house. Leaving felt like abandoning them. Without thinking, Julia reached for his hand. You honor them by staying, by building this life. They're part of this place now, part of its beauty. Vincent looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. Something intense and complicated moved in his eyes. When did you become the wise one? I'm not wise, Julia said. I'm just someone who knows what it feels like to carry regrets. What do you regret, Julia? Vincent asked gently. And there, under the vast New Mexico sky with the wind whispering through the grass, Julia found herself telling him everything. About her parents' deaths when she was 19, the debts they had left behind, her desperation for work. About taking the job at the gambling hall because it paid better than factory work or laundering, about the degradation of it, the constant fear, the way it had worn down her soul piece by piece. And finally, haltingly, she told him about the fire, about the businessmen who had attacked her, about running rather than facing the consequences of something that wasn't her fault. Vincent listened without interruption, his hand steady in hers. When she finished, tears were running down her face and she waited for him to pull away to look at her with disgust or pity. Instead, he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a careful embrace. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, he said softly. You did nothing wrong, Julia. You were trying to survive, and when that man attacked you, you defended yourself. The fire was an accident. None of that is your fault. But people lost their jobs, Julia said against his chest. The owner lost his business. The owner lost his business because he employed a man who thought he could assault a woman in his establishment, Vincent corrected firmly. That's on them, not you. You've spent too long carrying shame that doesn't belong to you. His words, his unwavering support, broke something open in Julia. She clung to him and cried, releasing months of guilt and fear and self-recrimination. And Vincent held her through it all, solid and steady, until her tears finally subsided. When she pulled back, embarrassed by her emotional display, Vincent gently wiped her tears with his thumb. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, he said. To survive what you've survived and still be kind, still be willing to trust, that takes real courage. Julia looked up into his eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch. It wasn't just sympathy or respect. It was something deeper, warmer, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Vincent, she started, but he shook his head. I know, he said quietly. I feel it too, but we should take this slow. We're both carrying a lot of weight, and I don't want to rush into something we're not ready for." Julia nodded, grateful for his wisdom even as part of her wanted to throw caution aside. Slow is good. They rode back to the ranch as the sun began to set, painting the desert in impossible shades of orange and purple. The easy conversation had returned, but underneath, it hummed an awareness of each other, a promise of something more. The weeks that followed were both wonderful and frustrating. Vincent and Julia danced around their growing feelings, each afraid to push too hard, to want too much. But the attraction between them was undeniable. They found excuses to touch, hands brushing as they worked together in the kitchen, shoulders bumping as they sat side by side on the porch in the evenings when Julia's ride was late. They talked about their dreams for the future, carefully including each other in those dreams without quite saying so directly. The people of Steins Pass began to notice. Mrs. Henderson watched with knowing eyes but kept her thoughts to herself. Others, like Mrs. Crawford, whispered and speculated. But Vincent had made his position clear, and most people respected him too much to openly criticize. In November, a cold snap brought the first real taste of winter to the high desert. Julia arrived one morning to find Vincent splitting wood for the fireplace, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She made hot coffee and brought him a cup, and he accepted it gratefully, their fingers lingering together on the warm ceramic. "Thank you," he said. "You take good care of me." "You take good care of me too," Julia replied, meaning it in ways that went far beyond employment. Vincent set down the cup and took both of her hands in his. "Julia, I need to say something, and I need you to really hear me. I know we agreed to take things slow, and I respect that. But I also need you to know that what I feel for you, it's real. You've brought light back into my life. This house feels like a home again because you're in it. When you're not here, I count the hours until you will be. And I know it might be too soon. I know we've only known each other a few months, but I'm falling in love with you. I think I've been since that first day when you looked at me without judgment." Julia's heart soared. "Vincent, I'm falling in love with you too. I tried not to. I was scared of getting hurt, scared that once you really knew me, you'd see all my flaws and broken pieces. But you see them already, and you don't turn away." "I don't turn away because those so-called flaws are part of what makes you who you are," Vincent said. "You're beautiful to me, Julia. Not just your face, but your heart, your spirit, your strength. I don't want just an employee. I want a partner. I want you by my side building this life, this ranch. I want to wake up to you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night." "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Julia whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Vincent dropped to one knee right there in the cold November morning, still holding her hands. "Julia Norton, will you marry me? Will you let me love you the way you deserve to be loved, and build a future with me here in this wild, beautiful place?" "Yes," Julia said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Vincent, I'll marry you." He stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that made her whole body sing. It was a kiss full of promise and hope, of two wounded souls finding healing in each other. When they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "I should probably ask you properly when I have a ring," Vincent said, laughing. "I don't need a ring," Julia replied. "I just need you." But Vincent insisted on doing things right. That afternoon, they rode into Steins Pass together and went to the small jewelry store where Vincent purchased a simple gold band with a small garnet stone. He slipped it onto Julia's finger right there in the store, and the proprietor congratulated them warmly. Word spread through the town quickly. Mrs. Henderson hugged them both when they stopped by the boarding house to share the news. "I knew it," she said delightedly. "From the first day I saw you two together, I knew you were meant for each other. Not everyone was as enthusiastic, Mrs. Crawford made pointed comments about indecent haste, but Vincent shut her down quickly. Julia and I are both adults, and how quickly or slowly we choose to proceed is no one's business but our own. They decided to marry quickly. Neither of them had family to invite, no need for elaborate preparations. The Reverend agreed to perform the ceremony in his small church 2 weeks before Christmas. Julia moved her few belongings from the boarding house to the ranch, and Mrs. Henderson helped her prepare a simple wedding dress, altering one of the older woman's own gowns to fit Julia's slimmer frame. On a crisp December morning, Julia Norton became Julia Jameson. The ceremony was small, with just Mrs. Henderson, the mercantile owner Mr. Paulson and his wife, and a handful of other townspeople in attendance. But to Julia, walking down the short aisle toward Vincent, who waited at the altar with tears in his eyes, it felt more significant than if they had had a cathedral full of guests. Vincent's voice was steady as he spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish her, to be faithful and true. When it was Julia's turn, she looked into his eyes and promised the same, adding, "You gave me back my future when I thought I had lost it. I will love you for the rest of my life." The kiss that sealed their marriage was sweet and chaste, appropriate for the church setting. But the promise in it was clear to them both. They had a simple meal at the restaurant with their small group of well-wishers. Then Vincent drove Julia home to the ranch in the wagon. Home. The word resonated in Julia's heart. She finally had a home again, a place where she belonged, a person who loved her despite knowing the worst of her past. That night, in the bedroom that Vincent had carefully prepared, adding touches of comfort and beauty for his new bride, they came together as husband and wife. Vincent was gentle and patient, aware that Julia's past experiences with men had not been kind. He took his time, worshiping her with hands and lips until she relaxed into the pleasure, until she understood that this was different, that this was love. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of the fire in the other room. "I love you," Vincent murmured against her hair. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. Thank you for taking a chance on me." "Thank you for taking a chance on me," Julia replied, "for believing I was worth more than my mistakes." "You were always worth more," Vincent said firmly. "You just needed someone to help you see it." The winter passed in a haze of happiness. Julia threw herself into making the ranch house a real home, adding curtains and cushions, cooking elaborate meals, even starting a small herb garden in the kitchen window. Vincent taught her to ride better, to rope cattle, to shoot a rifle for protection when he was out on the range. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, still amazed by the love they had found. In March, Julia realized she had missed her monthly bleeding twice. At first, she was afraid to hope, remembering what had happened to Emily. But when the sickness started, the overwhelming fatigue and sensitivity to smells, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. She told Vincent one evening after supper as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. He went very still when she spoke the words, and Julia saw fear flash across his face. "Vincent, talk to me," she said gently. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "Julia, I can't lose you. I can't go through that again." Julia took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "You won't lose me. What happened to Emily was a tragedy, but it doesn't mean the same thing will happen to me. And even if it does, even if something goes wrong, wouldn't you rather have tried? Wouldn't you rather have this chance at the family we both want?" Vincent pulled her close, his whole body shaking. "I want this baby so much, but I want you more. If it came down to a choice, it won't," Julia said with more confidence than she felt. "We're going to be fine. We're going to have a healthy baby, and we're going to raise them together in this beautiful place." Over the following months, Vincent was anxiously attentive. He insisted Julia rest more, do less physical work. He hired a young woman from town to help with the heavy household tasks. As Julia's belly swelled with their growing child, Vincent would rest his hand on it in wonder, feeling the baby move, talking to the unborn life about the ranch and the horses and all the things they would do together. In September, almost exactly a year after Julia had first arrived in Steins Pass, she went into labor. Vincent immediately sent for the doctor from the nearest town, unwilling to risk anything. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Julia saw the terror in Vincent's eyes, the memories of Emily's death haunting him. But she held his hand and pushed through the pain, determined to bring their child safely into the world. As dawn broke over the desert, their son was born, squalling and healthy. The doctor placed the baby in Julia's arms, and she looked down at the tiny face, overcome with love. Vincent stood beside the bed, tears streaming down his face, one hand on Julia's shoulder and the other gently touching his son's head. "We did it," Julia whispered, exhausted but triumphant. "You did it," Vincent corrected. "You're the strongest person I know." They named him Samuel Vincent Jameson, and he became the center of their world. Vincent was a devoted father, rising in the night to bring the baby to Julia for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, singing lullabies in his rough voice that made Julia fall even more in love with him. Watching this strong, weathered rancher cradle their tiny son with infinite tenderness was a joy that never faded. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Vincent expanded the herd with Julia's encouragement, and they hired a few hands to help with the increased work. Julia had a gift for managing the household finances, and under her careful oversight, they began to build real wealth. They added onto the house, creating more bedrooms in anticipation of future children. When Samuel was 3, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Rose Emily, honoring Vincent's first wife. The birth was easier this time, and Julia recovered quickly. Vincent held his daughter with wonder, marveling at her delicate features, her tiny fingers wrapped around his calloused one. "She looks like you," he told Julia. "She has your eyes," Julia replied. 2 years later came another son, James, and then 2 years after that, a daughter they named Grace. The house that had once been silent and empty now rang with children's laughter, with the chaos and joy of a growing family. Julia watched Vincent with their children, and knew that the ghosts of his past had finally been laid to rest, replaced by the vibrant life they were building together. The people of Steins Pass, who had once whispered about Julia's sudden arrival and quick marriage to Vincent, now spoke of the Jameson family with respect and even a touch of awe. They had built one of the most successful ranches in the territory through hard work and mutual devotion. Julia involved herself in the town's charitable works, helping other women who found themselves in desperate circumstances, offering them the same kind of second chance that she had been given. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vincent took Julia back to the north pasture where they had first confessed their love. The children were spending the night with Mrs. Henderson, who doted on them as though they were her own grandchildren. Vincent and Julia rode out in the afternoon, taking their time, enjoying the spectacular autumn colors. At the overlook, Vincent spread a blanket and unpacked a picnic dinner that he had prepared himself, making Julia laugh at his earnest attempts at domesticity. They ate and watched the sun set, and when the stars began to emerge, Vincent pulled Julia close. "10 years ago, I was a broken man," he said. "I thought my life was over, that all I had ahead of me was endless work and loneliness. And then you arrived, ashamed of your past, afraid to hope for better. And I told you that the only thing that matters is our future. "Do you remember?" "I remember," Julia said softly. "Those words changed my life." "They changed mine too," Vincent said, "because speaking them out loud made me believe them again, made me realize that I could have a future worth living. And now look at us. 4 beautiful children, a thriving ranch, a love that grows stronger every year. We took our broken pieces and built something beautiful." Julia looked at the man who had saved her with his faith and love, who had shown her that she was worthy of good things, worthy of happiness. "I love you, Vincent Jameson. Thank you for seeing past who I was to who I could become." "I love you, Julia Jameson," Vincent replied. "Thank you for having the courage to take a chance on a lonely rancher with a broken heart." They kissed under the stars, in the place where they had first opened their hearts to each other, and Julia felt the rightness of her life settle over her like a benediction. The shame of her past had faded, replaced by pride in what she had built, who she had become. She was no longer the frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Steins Pass, carrying her secrets like chains. She was Julia Jameson, wife, mother, rancher, beloved and loving. The years continued to be kind to them. The children grew strong and healthy, each developing their own personalities and talents. Samuel showed an aptitude for working with the animals and spent every spare moment at his father's side, learning the business of ranching. Rose was quiet and studious, reminding Julia painfully of herself, and Julia made sure her daughter had all the books and education she craved. James was the wild one, always exploring, always pushing boundaries, giving them equal measures of pride and worry. And Grace was the heart of the family, the peacemaker who could make anyone smile. Vincent's hair went gray at the temples, and lines deepened around his eyes, but he remained strong and vigorous, still putting in full days of work on the ranch. Julia, too, showed the marks of time and hard work, but she wore them with pride. They had earned their lines and gray hairs through years of love and labor, raising children and building a legacy. When Samuel turned 18, he asked permission to take over more responsibility for the ranch operations. Vincent agreed readily, pleased to see his son stepping into his role. Samuel had grown into a fine young man, combining Vincent's work ethic with Julia's careful planning. They had no doubt he would continue to build on what they had created. On a warm spring evening when Julia was 42 and Vincent 48, they sat together on the porch as they had countless evenings before. The children were grown now, though not yet gone. Samuel had just returned from checking the north pasture. Rose was in town helping Mrs. Henderson, who was elderly now but still spry. James and Grace were finishing up the day's chores. "I've been thinking," Vincent said, taking Julia's hand. "Maybe it's time to let Samuel take over more of the day-to-day operations. We could travel a bit, see more of the country. We've worked hard all these years. Maybe it's time to slow down, enjoy the fruits of our labor." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder. "Where would you want to go?" "I don't know," Vincent admitted. "But wherever it is, I want you by my side. That's all that's ever mattered, having you with me." "We've built a good life, haven't we?" Julia said, looking out over the ranch that had become her whole world. "The best life," Vincent agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible." Julia thought about the frightened young woman who had arrived in Steins Pass so many years ago, convinced she was irredeemable, that her past mistakes would forever define her. She thought about the lonely rancher who had opened his heart to her, who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. And she thought about the family they had built together, the love that had sustained them through every challenge, every joy, every ordinary day that had added up to an extraordinary life. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Vincent asked. "For believing in our future when I couldn't believe in it myself, for loving me, for giving me a home and a family and a life worth living." Vincent pressed a kiss to her hair. "You gave me all those things too, my love. You saved me just as much as I saved you. We saved each other." As the stars emerged over the desert, over the land they had tended and loved for so many years, Vincent and Julia Jameson sat together in perfect peace. Their past, which had once weighed so heavily, had faded into memory, transformed by time and love into nothing more than the foundation upon which they had built their beautiful future. And that future stretched ahead of them still, full of promise and possibility, as vast and beautiful as the New Mexico sky. Their children came home for dinner that night, gathering around the large table that Vincent had built years ago to accommodate their growing family. There was laughter and teasing, stories shared about the day's work, plans made for the coming week. Julia served the meal she had prepared, moving between her family with practiced ease, and watched with full heart as Vincent carved the roast, as Samuel discussed cattle prices, as Rose shared news from town, as James recounted an adventure with obvious embellishment, as Grace made them all laugh with her gentle humor. This was everything Julia had never dared to dream of during those dark days in St. Louis. This abundance of love, this sense of belonging, this absolute certainty that she was valued and cherished. Vincent caught her eye across the table and winked, and Julia felt her heart swell with gratitude. Later, after the children had returned to their own pursuits and the kitchen was clean, Julia and Vincent walked hand in hand to the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. They visited regularly, keeping the graves tended, speaking to Emily and the baby boy who had died so long ago. Julia no longer felt the pang of jealousy or insecurity she had once experienced when thinking about Vincent's first wife. Instead, she felt a connection to the woman who had loved him first, who had given her life trying to give him the family he wanted. "We had 4 children," Vincent told the headstone softly. "Samuel, Rose, James, and Grace. They're all growing up strong and good. I wish you could have known them, Emily. I wish things had been different, but I want you to know that I'm happy. Julia made me happy again. I hope that's okay." Julia squeezed his hand, and they stood in silence for a moment before walking back to the house. The past and present coexisted peacefully here, each given its due, neither diminishing the other. As the years continued to pass, the pattern of their lives took on a comfortable rhythm. Samuel married a young woman from a neighboring ranch, a smart and capable girl named Catherine, and they began building their own home on Jameson land. Rose moved to Santa Fe to teach school, carrying on the legacy of Vincent's first wife in her own way. James joined the Territorial Rangers, satisfying his need for adventure while still returning home regularly. And Grace, their youngest, surprised everyone by developing a talent for horse breeding, working closely with her father to build that side of the ranch business. Vincent and Julia became grandparents, first to Samuel and Catherine's twin boys, then to Rose's daughter born between teaching terms. Each grandchild was welcomed with joy, with Vincent proving to be as devoted a grandfather as he had been a father. Julia watched him teach the boys to rope, to ride, to respect the land and animals, and saw her own legacy continuing through their children and grandchildren. They never did take that trip to see the country. Somehow, there was always something that needed doing on the ranch, always a reason to stay. But neither of them minded. The ranch was their world, and it was enough. On their 20th anniversary, Vincent took Julia to the jeweler in town and bought her a new ring, a beautiful band with multiple small diamonds that sparkled in the sun. "You deserve more than the simple garnet I gave you when we got engaged," he said as he slipped it on her finger alongside her worn wedding band. "I love the garnet," Julia protested. It represents where we started. Then wear them both, Vincent said. The old and the new, the past and the present, all together. Julia did exactly that, wearing both rings for the rest of her life, symbols of the journey she and Vincent had taken together. As they entered their 50s, both Vincent and Julia finally began to slow down, letting the next generation take over more of the ranch work. Samuel ran the day-to-day operations with Catherine at his side, proving to be a worthy successor to his father. Vincent still consulted on major decisions, still spent time working with the horses and cattle he loved, but he also took time to simply sit with Julia on the porch, watching the desert sunset, talking about everything and nothing, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. They had both survived things that should have broken them, had carried pain and shame and grief that could have destroyed them. But they had found each other in this wild, beautiful place, and together they had built something lasting. Their love had healed old wounds, had created new life, had transformed sorrow into joy. Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully in her sleep when Julia was 54, and Julia wept at the funeral for the woman who had been friend and mentor, who had helped her take the first steps toward her new life. Vincent held her as she grieved, understanding her tears were not just for Mrs. Henderson, but for all the people they had lost along the way, all the chances and changes that had brought them to this moment. She would be proud of you, Vincent told Julia, of everything you've become, everything you've built. I hope so, Julia said. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. She gave me that first chance. And you took that chance and ran with it, Vincent reminded her. That was all you, my love. Your courage, your strength, your determination to be better than your circumstances. As they entered their 60s, their hair fully gray now, their faces lined with age and experience, Vincent and Julia remained as devoted to each other as they had been as newlyweds. They moved a bit slower, tired more easily, but their love had only deepened with time. They knew each other's thoughts, could communicate with just a look, had lived together so long that they moved through their days in perfect synchronization. Their children were settled now, their grandchildren growing into their own lives. The ranch was prospering under Samuel's leadership, the family name respected throughout the territory. Everything they had worked for had come to fruition. On a cool October evening, Julia and Vincent rode out to the north pasture one last time, moving slowly on horses that were as aged as they were. They sat at their special place, looking out over the land they had loved and tended for so many years. The sunset was spectacular, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. You remember the first time we came here? Vincent asked. When you told me about St. Louis. I remember, Julia said. I was so scared. I thought you would reject me once you knew the truth. I remember thinking how brave you were, Vincent replied. How amazing that you had survived all of that and were still willing to trust me with your story. That's when I knew I loved you, Julia. Right then, in that moment. You told me that the only thing that matters is our future, Julia recalled. Those words saved me, Vincent. They gave me permission to stop carrying all that shame, to believe I deserved something better. And what a future we've had, Vincent said, pulling her close. Better than anything I could have imagined. They sat together as the stars emerged, holding hands, remembering all the days and years that had brought them to this moment. Two broken people who had found wholeness in each other, who had built a life of love and purpose from the ashes of their pasts. Julia rested her head on Vincent's shoulder and felt utterly at peace. She was no longer ashamed of her past, no longer defined by her mistakes. She was Julia Jameson, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, a woman who had survived and thrived, who had created a legacy of love that would continue through her children and grandchildren for generations to come. "I love you," she said softly. "Thank you for a beautiful life." "I love you," Vincent replied. "Thank you for sharing it with me." They rode home under the stars, back to the ranch house that had become a home, back to the life they had built together. And in the years that followed, they continued to live with purpose and joy, surrounded by family, sustained by love, grateful for every day they had been given. When Vincent passed away peacefully in his sleep at 72, Julia grieved deeply, but found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the knowledge that he had lived a full and happy life after the tragedy of Emily's death. She lived another 5 years, spending her days helping Catherine run the household, teaching her granddaughters to cook and sew, telling stories of the old days to anyone who would listen. The story of how she and Vincent had met, how a lonely rancher had given a desperate woman a second chance and found love in the process, became part of the family lore. Their grandchildren would ask Julia to tell it again and again, never tiring of the romance of it, the proof that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Julia passed away surrounded by family, her hand held by Samuel, her daughters and son gathered around her bed, her grandchildren waiting outside. Her last words were, "Tell your father I'm coming home," and there was a smile on her face as she took her final breath. They buried her beside Vincent on the hill behind the ranch house, and the family gathered to remember them both. Samuel spoke at the service, his voice steady despite his tears. "My parents taught us that our past doesn't define us, that what matters is what we choose to build with the chances we're given. They took their broken pieces and created something beautiful, a family and a legacy that will continue for generations. They loved each other completely, and they loved us completely, and that love changed everything." The years passed, and the Jameson Ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's leadership and then under his sons. The story of Vincent and Julia became family legend, told and retold, their love story inspiring future generations to believe in second chances, in the power of love to transform lives, in the importance of looking toward the future rather than being chained by the past. The graves on the hill were tended carefully, flowers planted around the headstones each spring. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right across the desert, when the sunset painted the sky in impossible colors, when the air smelled of sage and rain, the family members who gathered there swore they could feel Vincent and Julia's presence, their love still watching over the land and the people they had cherished. Their story, which had begun with shame and loneliness, ended with love and legacy, proof that even in the harsh and unforgiving Wild West, two broken souls could find healing in each other and build a future worth living. The only thing that had mattered was their future, and the future they built together was more beautiful than either of them had dared to dream.